I'm so excited to be here with Steve. We've met, exactly 30 years ago when we worked for an exhibition here with Suzanne Paget at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris called Live Live, which is a kind of a survey on English art in the UK in the 1990s, with also many artist-run spaces. We made a kind of a map. David really drew a map of all these spaces, and Steve did a very, very important contribution to that show. We then continued with a solo show at the Musée d'Art Moderne, still in 2003, before I moved to London and continued there, actually last year at the Serpentine with the project Grenfell. We're going to talk about all of that later. We also did a project together at the Sir John Soane's house, a very little known piece, which we're going to discuss today. And I'm so happy Steve is here, because actually many, many years ago, I was here at Marian Goodman Gallery, supposed to do a conversation with Marisa Merz. And Marisa famously disliked interviews. She almost never gave one in her life. And 5 minutes before the interview started, she disappeared and she couldn't be found anymore. So when I came here this afternoon, I remembered that whole story, and I'm really grateful, Steve, that you're here. Anyway, before we begin, we should all give the amazing Steve McQueen a very warm welcome. And Steve, before we talk about the past and some other exhibitions you have, like the amazing show...
More about the future.
...right now, and before we talk about the future, because the future is the most important thing of this talk, we're going to talk about the exhibition here. The work, as mentioned in your introduction, actually a series of 47 photographs capturing these incredible flowers native to the Caribbean island of Grenada. And you said in a conversation that basically what has been constant in the landscape is the beauty of the flowers, and that these plants have been a marvel in a landscape traumatized by colonialism and slavery. Can you tell us about the genesis of this piece?
So Bounty started, again, when I was doing some research on Caribs Leap Western Deep, in a way, because it was 1654 when the French landed in Grenada. And no, Christopher Columbus named Grenada in the West Indies. But after then, the French came. But before the French came to Grenada, there was the native people who were the Arawaks, which were native people of Grenada. Then it was repopulated by the Caribs. The Caribs came from South America. So basically, they fought the Caribs, and the whole cannibalism, the whole idea of eating or killing and sort of eating your enemies, and they were the Caribs, the Arawaks. So then the island was repopulated by Caribs after the Arawaks. Then the French came, and in Grenada what happened is they fought the Caribs up until the northernest point of the island, where the Caribs, rather than surrendering, jumped to their death. Well, to jump to their death. We don't know if they thought it was death, but they jumped, rather than being sort of imprisoned by the French. And then the French called the northernest part of the island Satyrs, of course, meaning leapers. And they put a Catholic church there. And then after that was the war with the English rather. And then there was the war with English, and then the English fought the French, they won the island, and then repopulated the island with Africans. And then after that, after the abolition of slavery, they brought in large proportion of Indian and Chinese people to work the land. So therefore, the Caribbean has this sort of, it's a crazy place, because this is a place that's been repopulated 4 or 5 times. But what's been a constant thing in the landscape, because of course agriculture, again, it's always been about some kind of money, basically, if it's agriculture or whatever. So, but these things, these plants, they have been constant in the landscape. Some of them have been imported over to the West Indies and Grenada, but they've been a constant. And what's interesting for me is within art history is, flowers and painting of flowers, still lives and so forth and whatnot. But these still lives have been a witness to so much history within that island, and that they've been a constant. And again, you could think of Darwin sort of, how can I say, documenting sort of plants and animals and so forth. But what I loved about this situation in this context is a Carib, an Arawak, an African, a European, someone from China, someone from India would look at these flowers and just look at the wonder of them, because there were no use for anything else other than to look at to gaze, to look at, and to ponder. That was their purpose. There's nothing else these things did. And I imagine that sort of moment of wonder, just that moment of wonder within the context of the narrative of that country, of that island, was something I wanted to sort of look at, just to contemplate, within the context of so much unfortunate, violence, to be quite frank.
And it's not your first work created in Grenada, which is your parents' country of origins, but there are also earlier works. There is Carib Sleep in 2002, and then Ashes, which we discussed in our previous interview. And Ashes is very much in memory. It's a piece about the memory of the life of a young man who died very tragically, age 25, whom you had met on an earlier visit. Can you maybe tell us about that?
Well, it's not just Ashes, what I'm commemorating in that work. It's also Robbie Muller, the DP. Robbie was a very dear friend of mine, because Robbie shot that footage on Super 8. Because I saw Ashes one day, and I thought, this is this amazing, beautiful man. And I thought, who is this guy? I mean, he looked like, again, and he was this gentleman who was a very famous diver. So I said, and I got to know him. I said, look, Robbie, let's take Ashes out on the boat and let's shoot. Because I don't know, sometimes you have a sort of sense of something, you don't actually know something, you got a gut feeling about something, let's go with it. So we shot him, me and Robbie shot him. There's just 3 of us on the boat. The only person who's alive from that work is me, because Robbie died, Ashes died, of course. Now Ashes died, kind of a brutal death. That's another story. But we could talk about that in the context of the film, because when I shot that footage of Ashes, this beautiful, extraordinary, gorgeous man, dark as, again, they called him Ashes because he was so dark, and he was, he was like, he would have been a pop star in any other situation, or they would have made him a pop star. But he was so beautiful. So again, sitting on the edge of a boat, going into this endless horizon, it was all about possibility. I had no idea. I only discovered, it was like 5 years, I think 4 or 5 years later, that 3 months after we shot him on that boat, he was murdered. I didn't know until 5 years later. And of course, Robbie passed away. I don't know how many years after that, but Robbie passed away. So again, yes, it is about who knew at the time one was doing, but there was a certain sense of the endless possibility he was moving into the horizon. And then, of course, the person who was holding the cameras is passed as well. So we could talk about that in the context. But again, there's always these histories upon histories upon histories within that continent.
Robbie was very important for your work, and we discussed that many times before. And you once told me the quote, what he told you, that a camera move should be as simple as a cat jumping on a table. Can you tell us about that, and also, what that kind of collaboration meant to you?
Well, it was more, it was just more talking. We talked a lot. And for Robbie, the idea of a cat sort of jumping on a table is the least amount of effort, that you do not draw attention. The camera doesn't draw attention to itself. So it's very practical, but at the same time, extremely graceful. I think that's what he meant. But my relationship with Robbie was just sort of, a mentor. I would go there, he would have his roll-up cigarettes, and we would just talk. We just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. And Robbie was a very, very simple person. He wouldn't know anything about the latest camera or anything about anything. He wouldn't even know about necessarily the film history, but he did know about a frame. And again, him as a Dutchman, again, reverting back to the flowers, again, he was very much about sort of, in a tradition of Dutch, sort of, from Vermeer, the whole idea of the frame, the whole idea of the sort of perspective and the composition. He was extraordinary. And
of course, Ashes has so much to do with memory, and it's the first time that you show in Paris actually in almost 10 years. And I remember in the previous, it was the opening here of your show in 2016, and there was, besides the film, there were also these neons, in dark blue neons, Remember Me, and it's all about memory. And memory is, of course, also what your more recent work on Grenfell is about, which we presented at the Serpentine last year. And basically, it was in December 2017 that you created this work in response to the fire that took place earlier that year, on June the 14th, at Grenfell Tower in North Kensington, where 72 people died in the tragedy. And it's a very important part of the presentation of the work. at the Serpentine was an integral part of that presentation was a text by your friend Paul Gilroy, who said, "Never again Grenfell." And to quote him here, Paul said it was not an accident. The uncontrollable fire that stole those precious lives had been predicted. Warnings were issued. Alarming arguments had been comprehensively laid out. The dangers were far from secret, but the risks were not acted upon. Can you tell us what prompted you to do this film? Because you realized in a way that otherwise this memory might disappear. And
no.
Yeah.
So when I heard about Grenfell, I was in Chicago shooting Widows, and I was just shocked because, you know, again, it comes back to my birth, because I was born less than a mile away from Grenfell. So that area of Ladbroke Grove, Notting Hill, it was a certain area that I sort of was very familiar with. In fact, I was born, next door was a place called Wormwood Scrubs, which was a notorious prison. So it was a hospital and a prison. And then Grenfell is just down the road. It was just very close to me, because I remember the last time I was in Grenfell Tower was for my friend Elizabetha had given birth, and she was there with her child. So it was just one of those things. It was just one of those things where I needed to do something about that building, because I knew as soon as they covered it up, because they put a facade over the building, I knew it would be like if it never happened. So it was a very big undertaking what we did, because we had to leaflet all the people around the neighborhood what I was going to do. And what I decided to do was actually go in a helicopter, as you do, and make my way from the outside, you know, out in the suburbs, outside towards Grenfell. So in the film, you see this almost like landscape vision of London. You don't know where you go to, but after quite a long while, you see this thing in the distance. You don't know what it was, but as you come towards it, for me, when I first saw Grenfell in the flesh myself, it felt like it looked like a burned out skull. Somehow it couldn't be a drone or that kind of nonsense. It had to be me physically viewing the building. And what I did was I spiraled around the tower, sort of just almost like to sort of map it with my eyes, map it, to sort of, it's almost like how can I say, it's almost like a whirling dervish, it's almost like a meditation, to look. And again, and then what you saw was the forensic teams in there actually doing their job. That's another story. That's another story about the police. That's another story. But the forensic teams and what we're doing. And it was one of those things where I knew that this material, because there's no material like this, you know, that if we didn't have this kind of material, again, film is a very odd thing. Sometimes, if we didn't shoot it, it didn't happen. And I knew that I had to sort of somehow capture it. And that's what we did. So yeah, it was one of those situations where there was instinct, but also how do I interact with this building? How do I negotiate, me as an artist, with this building? You know, and it was just important that I had to. For me, it was important that I had to find a way to do it, and eventually I did.
And the film begins very much in the countryside, the sound of a bird, and then all of a sudden the sound stops, and that aspect of silence is also important.
Yeah. So what happens is when we come towards the building, as we get close to the building. And we get really close, because we get very close to the building. You see the burnt out. You see really inside the building. I cut the sound because there's nothing more to be said. There's nothing. It's gone, and it worked. It worked just because you allow the viewer to have their own soundtrack or whatever it is to what they're seeing. It becomes again. It's your relationship to what you saw. I mean, we've got 83 people that were, or more, because undocumented workers, who died in that building for no reason at all, other than neglect.
And this was curated with Claude, who is also here today. And when we had these many conversations with Claude and you and I and the teams at the Serpentine, we very much focused, and that was something which was very important to you, that of course it would be a film which would not be distributed outside the gallery, that there would be no photography, there would be also, almost like in a memory way, a list of the names, there would be a room of sounds at the end. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Well, what was very important for me is it is not for sale. this artwork is not for sale. It's nothing for anything other than what it is. And the fact that we did it in the Serpentine, which is in the middle of this park, allows people to walk away from it into a green space and have their moment of contemplation. It's not another artwork next to it. It's not another distraction. You're back into the reality of a reality, but at least it gives you time to come out of it after a while. And again, it's the neighbouring borough of Westminster, of Kensington and Chelsea, which is one of the richest boroughs in the world. But again, with a population, what's interesting about London is this mixture of rich living next to poor, working class living next to sort of people who are wealthy. But at the same time, they're not treated the same. And this was just a very obvious sort of demonstration of that. So I was just grateful to you and Claude for allowing us to show that piece in that location. We tried to get politicians to come and see it, but for some reason or the other, they were busy. We tried to we tried to get a lot of people, again, because, we're in the vicinity of Westminster. So it was very interesting how people just turned their backs on those people. It was just, again, it was very confrontational, but again, that's what I wanted, because there it is. Look, see it, you can't. There it is. Sometimes you just got to hold people to account in that way, and there it is. There's nothing to be said. This injustice is just there, with a level of sophistication that is not so didactic in that way. Because who's interested? Yeah, so what? But how do you make something out of something? Very important. How do you make something out of something? Yeah, and being in the moment up in the helicopter was very interesting. Being there in the moment. Because there's no cuts. How long is it? I think it's 20 minutes, is it? I think it's 20 minutes. There's no cuts, yeah.
And it's also kind of not an exhibition. It's different from an exhibition. It has a different temporality, because obviously it's now touring the UK in many different, you donated it to 2 public institutions, and it's now touring the UK from city to city. It was also almost like a campaign when it happened in London, because he wanted us to invite all the members of parliament. Maybe you could say a bit more about that, and also about...
Well, they didn't come, did they? So, that's the thing about, you're holding people to account and they just ignore you. So, you do what you could do.
And it's now touring the UK, no?
Yeah, right now we were in Wales, and we just finished Wales, and then we're in Belfast. So we're taking the work and we're touring the work. So again, it's been great because Grenfell United, the charity, but the families and the next of kin have organized, go with it and talk to people. Because what I wanted to do with this piece, Grenfell, was negate media, negate the media, negate the news or the newspapers or this sort of things you find on the internet. I wanted to negate that and get to a point where art can actually do something, I think, quite profound, where you're sitting there in time with this subject. It's not a news clip. It's not propaganda. It is art providing a space for you to look. I mean, that's the great thing about art. It could present something in a totally different way to what is out there. That's what we're about as artists. That's what we're about as curators. That art can actually put people in a state of mind which is very different from all the noise which is out there. That's what we want to do. That's the power of art. I think what's interesting about that is sometimes I say the word art, and it's like, it's about art, and I find it very silly. But what I mean by that, because often it is very silly. It's not doing anything. It's decoration. It's lifestyle. It's wank. It's bollocks. It's shit. It's just it's lifestyle. And I think it could be dangerous. I think it could be vital. I think it could be important. And that's what we try to do with putting Grenfell. But doing it like this really puts you, as the audience member, in the center of the relationship with that building, And in the context, we're flying along, and you'll think, okay, who am I within this landscape? Who am I within this? And then you're confronted with this building, and you start to ask yourself questions. And that's the power of art, I think, at least.
And I was rereading this morning one of the very earliest interview you ever gave to Patricia Bickos in the early 90s. And you said there already that you kind of want, with the presentation of your work, to get away from a kind of a popcorn mentality, you just kind of project the film, and then you want the viewer to be a participant, not a passive viewer. And that also led you to actually initially make it a silent experience, because you wanted people also to be aware of themselves. But of course, that idea of being aware of oneself and having a participatory experience is what many of us have just experienced. You know, those who saw it at DIA experienced it there, and those who were in Basel actually earlier this week experienced it at the Schaulager in Basel with your amazing project BAS, which is in a way a project without screens. It's your most abstract project in a way in that sense. And you told in the conversation to the art newspaper that it started 20 years ago when you were thinking about light and color and mass and visibility, and that you actually talked to a physicist about the density of light and how light travels and how we see and how we look. And then with the audio aspect of it, you were thinking of the middle passage. Can you tell us in a way about how you came from these conversations with the physicist to then this connection also to history and how this piece, which very much, as you said, 25, actually 30 years ago, already you want the viewer to be a participant?
Well, actually, I think it was 2020, 2003. I had a conversation with Arnett Coleman. I was going to do a collaboration with Arnett, and I met him. I think in the sort of the studio apartment. Some other musicians, there are a lot of people that seem to be in the studio, musicians with Arnett Coleman, and we talked about I wanted to collaborate with him. But when I first met Arnett Coleman, it was like trying to tune into a radio. I didn't understand the bloody word he was saying. It was like, what is going on? And I was like dialing it's like dialing a radio, and I got static, and I was trying to tune in, because this guy was talking to me, but I was trying to get into his wavelength, you know? And I was tuning the radio, and all of a sudden I got static. Then I got something. Okay, I'm in. I got you. You know, sometimes you got to go with the groove. You got to get in someone's head. And all of a sudden he said to me, my mother didn't give me anything, and my father didn't give me anything. My mother didn't give me anything, and my father didn't give me anything. And it wasn't a diss. It was more, what I understood was that they didn't give him any weight. They gave him a space to walk free, meaning that they didn't give him any weight. And I was like, oh. But it was just it was just one of the most interesting conversations. But what I came away with is that I wasn't ready yet. So I sort of, we had this conversation. I thought, yes, we could come back to the conversation, but I didn't really have another conversation with him because I thought, no, I'm not ready yet. But I took that with me. So that was a starting point for bass on that. And then I think beforehand was dealing with the light and stuff like that, because I knew that I wanted to do something with the whole idea of, because I wanted it all. I wanted to incorporate and encapsulate everything. And the way I thought I could do that was, of course, light, because that's what makes things visible in some ways, and that's what, the way you see how light, how things are denser, and again, how light makes images. So that was the beginning of it, really. And then carrying it on through the middle, I had this conversation with Oqui, where he's, again, a lot of death. So Oqui, I had this conversation with him when he was in Munich, and he's in a hospital bed. We started talking about the abstraction in my work. And, we started talking about abstraction in my work, and I had this idea, and he was doing this biennial. I thought, well, I'm interested in taking these musicians from the diaspora, from African diaspora, starting from somewhere maybe in Ghana, and traveling to Brazil, to Bahia. And on that boat, we make music. I said, find out what occur, tracing that journey. So cut long story short, of course, with bass, I just gathered up some musicians, Marcus Muller, and some other amazing musicians in the basement of DIA, underneath these lights, which had been sort of color coordinated to convey the spectrum and to play on these lights. And I had a conversation with these musicians about what I was interested in with this middle passage. Now, I had spoken to them before on Zoom, and it was just amazing because within a certain amount of time, things amalgamated. And I was sort of orchestrating, but I was thinking, things instantly came in. Marcus was doing his thing, and then it was amazing. There's a gentleman from Mali. He was extraordinary with this music, with this instrument. There's the upright bassist, who was extraordinary, the 18-year-old girl who was basically, woman rather, who, you know, she played like she was 80, she spoke like she was 14. It was extraordinary. And then the Grammy award-winning bassist. But what happened within that space was extraordinary, because I don't know what happened. Because when I hear the music now, you know, when you do something, you say, how did I do that? I was so in the moment, sweating, knowing what to do, knowing what not to do when you're in the moment, working with musicians. I never worked with musicians before. But with Marcus and these guys, I knew exactly what to do, how I wanted it. And when I listen to it now, I think to myself, I could never do that again. Because the moment, that's why I think what's interesting about, as far as art and stuff, is WORK, work, to make. Making in the moment, you know exactly what to do. At least I've come to that point. Because I've been training for years to get to a moment when I'm there and I know what to do or how to do it. If I come out of that, I couldn't tell you how I did it. I couldn't. But knowing what to do in the moment, I knew exactly what to do. I knew, no, not that, no, extend that. Yeah, Marcus comes in with something, maybe we should not repeat that, but we should. I knew what to do. But I could never, ever in life do that again. Maybe I'll do something different, but never that. But, you know, it's very strange. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe that's what Whistler meant, you know, when he said art happens. But I remember a conversation, we were in New York, and it was the opening of the Shed, and you were there with Quincy Jones, the late Quincy Jones. And I remember you told me that day that Quincy had told you something really important for that piece, which has to do with this idea of the frequency, basically, of what usually is music in the background, is suddenly comes to the forefront.
What Quincy told me was bass, the electric bass changed music. So that was another piece. Arnett, Quincy. So all these things maybe were leading to this road, and then working with Donna De Silva, Donna, who was here. Donna, where are you? Actually, oh, she's here. Donna from Dear, who's here. Yeah, she's great.
You should give Donna an applause.
Yeah.
Round of applause.
I mean, working with her on bass in Dear again. So again, all these things came to that moment where we get the Dear version and we get the Basel version. So, but for me, it was always Lights Off. But it actually even goes back again to, I did an artwork called Blues Before Sunrise. Again, and that doesn't have, that's when there's a place called Vondelpark, it's like the largest park in Amsterdam, where I put all the street lights in the park, I made them blue. And again, I have the idea, so all at night until sunrise. It's after a sort of famous blues tune, actually made by Native American.
That's a public sculpture, right?
That was a public sculpture,
always there, 275 filters, basically, blue filters on these lamps.
Yeah. So in some ways, it's a precursor to bass in a way, because again, it's formless. And again, the actual music, which was the title. Blues Before Sunrise, yeah. Yeah,
but it is, I did actually think of the experience, you know, in Amsterdam with that piece, because the people there, the people from the city who encounter that piece in the park, they, of course, in a way perform in the piece. And so it was almost like a stage. I mean, as you set a stage as a mise en scène to create an environment for action, for scenes. I mean, that's the connection, I think.
Yeah, again, certain environments and how things change nocturnally, because again, you know, the whole idea of cruising, you know, sort of gay cruising and sexual sort of playground that parks can be. And then in the daytime, people are picnicking. I just love the idea that how a space could be a certain different thing in a nocturnal environment, in a different light environment, and then in the day, it's something else. Again, so Blues Before Sunrise.
And then, of course, there is also the light. What's happening to the light with Bas? That's another connection to the Amsterdam piece. And I wanted to ask you to talk about that a little bit, because the piece is never twice the same. I was there for an hour, and there was no repetition. It will always be different.
You know, again, I think once you're in the space, it's about you, the viewer. You know, again, I think what bass does in some ways, it's a space for you, meaning that often in our everyday, there's no space. There's no space that will accommodate your thoughts or how you feel for a moment, or how you interact with yourself. There's no space. But this space does that. In a way, you walk in, you're confronted with the environment, which is the lights changing and this music. But what happens is there's sort of what's on sort of display in some ways is you within the context of that space. Similar to the Grenfell walking, you in the context of that environment. I never forget when I made this movie called Shame, and I was in New York, and I was staying in a skyscraper, because again, coming from London, the whole idea of living so high up in a building, I never, unless you're living in a tower, you never have that perspective. So I remember sort of looking out the window and said, who am I within all this city? All of a sudden, the telescope became a microscope on me. Who am I within this? Very odd to be confronted with who are you within this metropolis. So I think, interestingly enough, what bass allows is that for you as a viewer, often you go to a museum or a gallery or an institution, and you're looking at, you're confronted with something, you're looking at it. All of a sudden, within this space, what's on display in some ways is you. There's a moment where you're allowed, in fact, you're encouraged, in fact, to sort of be in your own head, I hope.
Thank you so much. And we talked a lot here about sound, and you also told me in our previous conversation that sound is becoming more and more, music and sound, important in your work. Now, we worked together on a piece at the time when most of your films were still silent, and it was basically very surprising to me, because I curated this show. It was a wonderful surprise that you all of a sudden, we all expected a film, and you basically created a sculpture with a mirror and one of Soane's table. The Sir John Soane's Museum, for those of you who haven't been, who has been to the Sir John Soane's Museum in London? It's very urgent to visit this museum. It's an extraordinary 19th century museum of the architect Sir John Soane's, a house museum. And in the late 90s, the artist Catherine Evans and I thought it would be nice to do a show there with contemporary art. So we just knocked at the door of the director and said, we'd love to do a show there. And we were very surprised, because she said yes. And she also said that they have a Soane's guest room, because, today that no longer exists, but they had a room on the top floor where basically people could, Soane's scholar could sleep. And there weren't many Soane's scholars who asked for it, so I could have the room for a year. So I lived actually in the museum and invited artists to come there and visit. And you did this extraordinary piece with very little known piece, which was an early sound piece. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, Soane Sound System 2. And it was a table from the museum, which I basically made a mirror that echoed the width and length of the table with the same kind of finishing, wooden finishing. So, funny enough, where I lived in Ealing, I lived like 15 minutes from Ealing Studios. The man in the white suit, all those kind of Ealing comedies and Ealing, again. When we had film industry in the 40s and 30s. And John Soane's house was just up the road. He which is now Ealing Library. That was John Soane's house. So there was a connection there from the beginning when I was a kid, going to get library books, John Soane's house. And there was it was interesting thing about echoing and reflecting. So that's what I was interested in, and things which are underneath. So those things which are sort of, the table, the surface, again, these things which are sort of resting places. In a way, it's a little bit of a stretch, but I just feel that those situations like a bass is the resting place for other things to perform on. A table is there for you to put the book on. It's there for you to sort of present. And I think this is the bass instrument is there for you to put, the rhythm and the sort of, the solo or the improvisation on top of, because it just keeps time. So I was just interested in that, really. That's what I was interested in.
Now, we promised at the beginning to talk about the future. I wanted to ask you about once upon a time when Suzanne Paget, Laurence Bosse, Eugène Scherf, and I had invited you to do this exhibition at the Musée d'Art Moderne. You wanted us to put you in touch with NASA. And I had a friend at NASA, Bill Clancy, who is the NASA research and advisor to the SETI, which is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. There's a lab at NASA for extraterrestrial intelligence. And there was also William Summerlin, a linguist and professor of anthropology at the University of Toronto, whom you brought in. So I wanted to ask you to tell us about the whole research of Once Upon a Time, which is, of course, this idea of NASA to kind of, for the future, bring a very sort of biased view of what is the knowledge on Earth on other planets.
Carl Sagan's widow was there. So it started with the whole idea of this gold disc of Voyager 2. It was put into space. What was it? Was it 77?
Yeah, 77. Yeah.
And it consisted, I can't remember how many images, but basically it was images that represented who we are as humans, beings, as well as sound. So it's very, thank you, it's very kind of from, people running in the Olympics, from, people in the supermarket even. It's very bizarre, these images of who to represent us in order for once a spacecraft or probe goes into orbit, maybe it comes across an extraterrestrial, it tells him or he or whatever it is who we are. So I was just interested in how these images were like, they were a story already. So we spoke to NASA, and NASA had the original slides, but unfortunately they were in very bad condition. A woman called Pip Lawrenson, who used to work for the Tate, she worked for the video and film department, got hold of the people at NASA and said, look, we will restore them. And we'll talk to the people at National Portrait Gallery to restore the original slides. So that's what we did. We got the original slides from NASA and restored them. Our payment was that we could use them for my artwork. And with that, I had these images. And the sound samples from Voyager were very kind of, again, you had Chuck Berry, Johnny B. Good, you had, sort of certain kinds of giraffes or whatever, all kinds of different kinds of ideas of what sound on Earth was. But somehow for me, I wanted it to be about sounds that we had no idea what they were about. And I like the idea of speaking in tongues. I like the idea of glossolalia, speaking to speaking tongues. And I went to Canada, I went to Toronto to speak to this linguist who specialized in glossolalia. And it was very strange. It was a Russian Orthodox sort of specialist who basically did all these field recordings in the sort of late 60s, early 70s of people who spoke glossolalia. And basically I put the two together as a narrative for that piece. That was, that was 2003, wasn't it? 2003 we did that show. Yeah, so it was interesting because we had a huge conference on Voyager 2, and Carl Sagan's widow was there. It was amazing. It was fascinating. Yeah.
Speaking in tongues has been used to describe two different phenomena. You mentioned already glossolalia, but there is also xenoglossia. Is that one sort of suddenly seems to speak a language one has never studied before? So that also was of interest for you.
Yeah, I mean, look, you could talk about things like again, people like John Coltrane. On that, we talked about improvisation. And how, and again, there's a certain kind of rapture. There's a certain sense of knowing what you're doing without understanding what you're doing. Similar to maybe how I worked with bass. And it just made sense. I don't know. Again, it's one of those things. There's this word called improvisation, which of course is relevant. But there's something more than just improvisation. It's not random. It's actually not random at all. It's very precise, because guess what? You know if it's wrong. So it's very odd. It's interesting. There's a certain kind of, it's like a taste or smell, or it's instinct. There's a certain thing which is right and is wrong within the whole idea. The whole idea of, it's like whirling dervishes. You spin to get out of control. The whole idea of getting out of control is to get closer to God. So again, there's another conversation to be had there, but I just love that idea of that sort of investigation. It was very strange talking to this Russian Orthodox he was an expert, and his field recordings, because I remember a very funny story. So it was like The Shining, because it was the time, remember when the bird flu was on? It was about bird flu. It was like 2000 and I can't remember, but I think it must have been 2002, 2003, the bird flu. Anyway, so I flew in to Toronto. The bloody snow was about this high. It was literally 1.5 meters high. It was ridiculous, the snow, very deep snow. And I go into this modernist sort of concrete slab of a building, the library, and he puts a quarter of an inch tape reel for me to look through these boxes of his research material and glossolalia. he did in the late 60s and 70s. And I put these reel-to-reel tapes on by myself, massive library, only me in this library, okay? And I'm putting this reel-to-reel tapes on, I've got headphones on to listen to this glossolalia, kind of like spooky glossolalia from all these field recordings. And I put this reel on, and this woman does this amazing glossolalia, this kind of verbal acrobatics. And all of a sudden she says, "Do not listen to this tape." I went, put the thing back in the thing. I walked home all by myself in this deep snow. It was like The Shining. And I didn't sleep a wink that night. My eyes were like this. I was anyway, moving on. But it was just anyway, little sidebar story there. But it was just interesting, these amazing field recordings of this glossolalia that he did. Yeah.
That's amazing. And you also told me at the time that the whole sort of Voyager thing and the golden record, the golden disc, is all about our so-called knowledge. Yeah. So obviously very biased towards Western knowledge. Yeah. And you said with the sound, it's all about what we don't know, in a way.
These images are very kind of National Geographic images in a way. Again, it's very, again, there's something attractive about them, but again, they're so removed at the same time. They're there were these kind of National Geographic images, but which I kind of liked because of this we're talking about 1977 and people trying to sort of get a grasp of it. There's an aesthetic to those images, aren't there? But at the same time, I was interested in those images because they're so removed. But at the same time, the sound, which is totally something else other than. So just putting the two together to sort of, kind of both of them, to make sense out of nonsense, really. Or try to at least have some kind of opinion on it by putting the two things together.
Now, this morning I've been rereading, all our sort of conversations we've done so far, and it's kind of interesting that in every conversation you talk about limbo. From the very first one, also in the one about Once Upon a Time, and you say we're living in limbo. We are not living in the past, we are not living in the future, we are living in between. Can you tell us about what that kind of recurrent limbo is? You also talk about it in some interviews I read in the Swiss press about Bass, about the Basel piece.
The starting point for Bass was the transatlantic crossing for people from Africa, West Africa, coming to the New World, Americas, as slaves. So there's that moment where you're not here or there. You're in this vessel. You're in this vessel. And again, Bass is not necessarily about that. In fact, what it is Bass is the runway. Then we take off, then we go somewhere else, then we go to some amazing places. But then again, this is a starting point. That limbo is a starting point. Because as who I am, as a black person, I'm brand new. I'm superhuman. We had to make our own religion, make our own language. We had to reinvent everything about ourselves because our basis was what we had in our immediacy. So what we had in our immediacy, we had to make something of. No religion, no language, things were cut off from us. So what we had in our immediacy, what memory we had, and what we could adapt to, what we could transformate into what we wanted, is what we did. So when you see the black culture in the Americas, and again elsewhere, it's totally modern. It's totally invented. I'm brand new. That's who I am. I'm brand new.
Thank you. Now more about the future.
Shiny and new.
More about the future. We wanted to kind of talk about the future of art, and one thing which I think I can see as a pattern right now that connects is, at the moment, a lot of artists are interested kind of in re-exploring public space, in doing things outside the doors of museums, or galleries. And of course, we're doing that at the Serpentine, for example, with the pavilions. They have no doors. The other day, a taxi driver dropped me in the park and wanted to tell me the story that he came on a walk with his daughter, and she suddenly ran into the pavilion because there are no doors, it's in the park, and now she wants to study architecture. And he said that was like a miracle because he always told his kids, museums are not for us, so they never went to a museum. So that idea that we can reach, people also with public art who would not necessarily go to a museum is something a lot of artists at the moment are interested in. You've done a lot of work in that direction, and I wanted to ask you first some realized projects in that direction and maybe unrealized. So one of the most amazing realized projects is, of course, your epic work, Year 3, from 2019, where you took photos of, I think, was it 76,000 London school kids, aged 7, 8, and these were then displayed on 600 billboards throughout London. So it was literally an exhibition on the scale of a city. Can you talk about that?
Well, the idea was to photograph every year 3 class in London. It's just that moment, again, it's that moment in life as a child. I think it was coming to 5, 6, 7, year 7, coming to be 6, 7, where race, class, and gender are just about coming into play. You know, there's an equality to a certain extent with children. You know, but at a certain time, people look at you and say, "Oh, you're poorer than me. Oh, you're Jewish. Oh, you're Asian. Oh, you're this." Or so the outside world or the adult world is sort of informing or putting things into different boxes for them. They're just coming to that realization of even, you know, gender, you know, of queer or whatever. So I was just interested, because again, I grew up in a school, you know, in London, which was absolutely amazing. Again, you know, I took it for granted not knowing how actually special it was. I mean, my school had every single nationality in it, and we just didn't. The only thing we were interested in is football and girls. That was it. That was the only thing. That was the only criteria. But it was interesting because I didn't realize at the time until I was older. Okay, oh, Raza was from Pakistan and Reza was from Iran. Oh, you know, because it didn't matter at that time. You know, so I wanted to capture a moment just before those things come into play. When, you know, and then what's interesting about London. So our attempt was to photograph every single school. So we got to the point where we photographed 73% of the schools in London of 7-year-olds. It was the only place where you could actually physically see the future of London. You know, you could go into that space in the galleries all over the Tate Britain. Obviously, there's thousands of photographs, as Hans already said. And you can actually see the future of London. And the future of London was black and brown and a bit of white. That was the future of London. Fact. And obviously some people didn't like that. But that's just the reality. And but at the same time, that was just before COVID. And I think, you know, it has a different narrative now. And again, you know, when I was going to school, certain things happened where certain people were going to Oxford and Cambridge, certain people weren't. And it's just interesting how certain people separated. Some people didn't speak to certain people anymore. Some people didn't hang with people. But we played football. We were hanging out yesterday. That all of a sudden, people knew their paths. Very strange, very interesting. So I just wanted to capture a certain moment just before that happened. And it's beautiful. And everyone was equal at that moment. For a moment, people were equal. It was great. It was, and also taking the photographs was very emotional in that way, because you go to these schools and they have no idea what's going to happen to them in the future. It didn't look good, you know? So we had this moment with these children. And what was lovely about that was then they would go to see their school or themselves in the Tate and realize that they had a place in this museum. So that was very interesting, because a lot of people now come up to me and, oh, my son or my daughter was in the Tate, because it meant a lot to be seen, to be actually seen. To be seen was very important, particularly in that context, of course. Again, a space that art provided. Not television, not the media, not all that nonsense, art provided. That's why art is so important, it's so amazing. And it shouldn't be sort of overrun with lifestyle and nonsense, you know?
Yeah, that's beautiful, a space that art provided. And we're talking about school. Earlier today, we had an amazing brainstorming with Abby Churchill, who is here, and with Simon Fatal, you and I, about, you know, the future of education and the idea of a kind of a new Black Mountain College. Abby and I are working with Lorraine Powell Jobs, and we of course talked to you several times before about the importance of that right now, and you talk about the early 90s, that it was comparatively cheap to study. You know, today students have to pay a lot of money to go to art school, And there are all these obstacles you mentioned of entry into art, about learning about it, about making it. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about that, about the necessity kind of reconnecting to different models of art education and also to make art schools free.
When I went to art school, what was exciting about it, I mean, up until you're sort of 18, 19 years old, you're told what to do. Since you're 4 years old, you're told what to do, when to do it, and how to do it, yeah? And that's what you want to do. And all of a sudden, you go to art school, and you're free. You go, whoa, I got a space, I could do what the hell I want to do. This is amazing, this is incredible. Wow, wow, wow. And after about 4 months, you're banging the door, please tell me what to do. Please, because you have a breakdown. No, please just tell me what to do, I got to do something. Because you're going through the process of trying to make language, trying to sort of propel yourself to discover. And it's very difficult after you've been told what to do, how to do it, and when to do it, to have the license to do it yourself. It's very, very hard. So you have a breakdown. And from that moment, you build yourself up. And that was the great thing about Goldsmiths, because you built yourself up with tutorials, you built yourself with group tutorials, you built yourself up in the way of these kind of conversations. And then from there, you attempt to make work. So I think this model was, for me, again, when I went to school, I would not have gone to art school because I wouldn't have been able to pay for it. I come from a working class background. So the whole idea of paying 9,000 or whatever, how much thousands, whatever it is to go to art school every year would have been a non-starter. So for me, an art school, as we discussed, it has to be about access, because art school is, at the end of the day, it's about ideas. That's what it's about. It's about ideas. That's all. I mean, that's it. And wherever those ideas come from, I mean, it's about ideas and to sort of upend ideas. So again, I think we're talking about art schools of the future. It has to be about a certain kind of access. And I don't want to be in a situation when I'm going to an art school and I'm walking into a space and like, oh my God, this is like when I went to art school 30, 40 years ago. That would be dangerous. That would be like, we're going backwards. So again, one has to see how one can accommodate students who want to be in a situation where they can actually discover themselves through working.
I've just been to Margate a few weeks ago to see the exhibition you curated there, which has now, I think, continued its journey to Edinburgh, and you've just come back from Edinburgh. It's an exhibition you curated of photographs, of protests, of demonstrations throughout sort of history of photographs in the UK, really, spanning a century. And you were asked in an interview in The Guardian what were your memories, and you talked about a demonstration, a strong memory you had from '88, actually, and that's very connected to what you just said, against the introduction of student loans. Education is a right, is a right, is a right. Education is a right, not a privilege. Can you tell us about that, and then about this exhibition and the amazing book also, which accompanies the show?
The show is called Resistance. And it started, actually, the idea of resistance started with the book King Leopold's Ghost, the book of the Belgium sort of head of state, the Leopold, who owned Congo. Anyway, the whole idea of the Congo, it actually goes back to another artwork that I was interested in doing, what I did, called Gravesend. Basically, again, there was this situation in Congo where people were enslaved and they had to gather rubber. And if you didn't gather enough rubber, the quota that you were given, you get your left hand cut off. So at that time, there were these priests there, these missionaries who had the first Kodak camera, the first portable Kodak camera. And that scandal was exposed by these images, these photographs that these priests took and they put out into the public domain, and that caused a scandal. And then, again, things started to sort of, stop, as it were, because it's such an uproar. And the idea of how photographs changed the landscape I was interested in. And I thought, okay, I love the idea of talking about a century of photography through photography, but also through protests. So I had this idea of how protests changed photography and how photography changed protests, starting with the suffragettes in 1903, and how they used photographs as propaganda in a way, and how they sort of devise or choreograph situations that people take photos of and put into the press. So they were very savvy. They were very savvy in how they were using this medium. And anyway, we go all the way through to again people learned from the suffragettes, who were just total badasses and had manipulated situations. So people take photographs of it, or how they demonstrated how can I say, encourage or to sort of corral others to sort of join forces. I love that situation within 100 years. So the last images are of the Gulf War, the Gulf War, which was in 2003, which was the largest street demonstration in the UK. So it spans that sort of that narrative of protest. I mean, it's amazing stuff in between. We got some great people to write for the catalogue, and the show just opened. We opened in Margate, and yesterday we opened in National Museum of Scotland. But if you get the catalogue, please, because I think coincidentally, obviously what's going on now in the world, it just fell at the right time. I think timing is very important. I think the exhibition is falling at the right time for young people, or people in general, to sort of be reminded of what has happened in the past and how one can at least sort of demonstrate. Because again, you got to think about these people. You got to think about the suffragettes. You got to think about these people. What I mean by that is they had no idea what the outcome would be. They had no idea. I mean, most of the time people think, okay, these people are mad, they're crazy. What are they doing? But these building blocks of what these women did was what changed the course of history. But they were on their own. They were called mad, they were called foolish, they were looked at, they were pointed at, they were stoned. But without them, much of what we take for granted now wouldn't have changed, just wouldn't. So, again, and they had no idea what they were doing would come out on the right side of history. And I think oftentimes we have to sort of take a chance. Otherwise, what we do? Otherwise, what are we? We got to take a chance. We're all going to die anyway.
I have one last question, because we decided today, because we're in the context of this amazing exhibition here, to focus more on your work with exhibitions. But obviously, talking about art which goes outside the gallery, where there are no doors, is of course your films, and your feature films. And we spoke about it already in the 90s. You, from the 90s onwards, had, in our very first conversation, had this very strong, will and desire and necessity to not only to work in the art world, but also go far beyond that. So we won't have time to talk about all of your feature films, but I wanted to talk about two recent ones, because it's interesting, because both of them have a very personal connection. In Occupied City, you look at the Nazi occupation of Amsterdam, and that has to do a lot with the schools of your children who they went to in Amsterdam. And then in Blitz, you look at the Blitzkrieg of London, which is, of course, again, very connected also to the biography, not only of yours, but also of your parents, who basically came because of that war to the UK. So I wanted to ask you to talk about these two films, which were released in quite a short time. And as far as I hear, talk about going into public space with art, with no doors, I hear that the film in Amsterdam will now be projected on the facade, I think, of a big building.
How do you know that, Hans? You always know everything before anyone else knows.
I don't know if it's been announced.
No, it hasn't been announced. Thank you.
I sometimes hear
ruining
rumors.
the surprise.
I sometimes hear
No, great. So I'll start with Occupied City, because Occupied City, again, this is where I live. I live in Amsterdam, and sometimes living in Amsterdam is like living with ghosts. And what I meant by that, when I first got there, again, it's a 17th century city, so certain views. I mean, I was looking at, Vermeer would have seen, whoever would have seen, Van Gogh would have seen. Again, it's like living in an archaeological dig in a way. And being from London, we didn't have that confrontation. I mean, in a way, it's kind of hidden in London as far as the war is concerned. And my wife was writing this book called Occupy City, 1945, about, addresses in Amsterdam and people who were, what was happening behind those. It was almost like seeing the city illuminated, seeing what was going on, where the resistance were, where the Nazi had their sort of canteens, where people were hiding. It was just basically, it's almost like you had X-ray vision eyes. You could see in buildings, see what was going on, what was concealed. So it was just fascinating what she was doing. But as I was walking around the city, it's really weird. It's almost like there were two narratives going on, the contemporary and the recent past. And then I thought, oh, what happens if I had this film, if I found some footage from like 1941, 42, whatever, 40, and then I project the exact same images on top of it. So it's like this. So one image is on top of the other perfectly. So you'll have the living and the dead on top of each other, but with the buildings will reinforce the frame because the same view will be there. I thought, wow, that'd be amazing. And this car is going through this woman, and you could see, you could physically see where you could walk through someone, and you could see it. But then I heard the tapping of the keys from my wife's office. I thought, oh, no. The past is text, and the present is the present. So I thought, okay, if I asked my wife, Ben, can I use the idea? She loved the idea. So using her text, I could project the present onto the past. So doing it with text was much more interesting because you get the information of what was going on in that building, what was happening in here, and somehow through the present, you see a certain kind of journey, you see a certain kind of irreverence of what has happened, what blood has been spilled in the streets, where you see kids playing hopscotch. You know what I mean? So it was fast with that tension. Again, it's similar. You could talk about Once Upon a Time or whatever, in a way. So yeah, text and sound and image. Yeah. So and that tension. So that was again because I was living it. Because for example, my daughter's school became a Jewish school where people were evacuated and murdered. Children were evacuated and murdered. My son's school was a prison, became a prison. Was a prison originally for people who were in the resistance. Again, you had this sort of poetry of life, things which jarred, things which could sort of were pushed together because of history, and not necessarily neatly so, but factually so. Interestingly enough, on my street where I live in Amsterdam, there was a guy who was in hiding, and how he paid for his being in hiding is he taught the child of the house owners how to play drums, but he couldn't make noise, so we'd just be tapping, and that's how he paid for his keep. Anyway, so then you have Blitz. So Blitz, again, of course, I'm a Londoner, and I think I was doing Small Acts at the time. I was researching for Small Acts as a film series I did about the Caribbean community in London from like late 60s to sort of mid 80s. So while I was doing the research, I found this image of this child, this boy, this black boy who's being evacuated into the countryside. So what happened with children in London is because the cities and towns were being bombed, they would evacuate children to sort of the villages. And just by seeing that child, I thought I had my in into a narrative of talking about the Second World War through a child's eyes. So that was it, really. So again, I think, listen, Blitz is a sort of the bookend to a kind of investigation that I've been doing. Even year 3 is part of that. So that's the end of that. And then we move on. But that was the bookend. Again, somehow you have to sort of unearth history. Unearth it to find a foundation for you to stand on. I need to be strong. I need to be stronger. In order to be strong or stronger, you have to find a foundation that you can plant your feet in, and then you move forward. So that was the end of that. That was the end of that. And again, these are histories that if you don't show them, they never happened. So now, thank you very much. I've done that. Move on. Again, you could even talk about hunger. Hunger as the beginning of that colonial sort of past of Northern Ireland. Again, and Bobby Sands. We could talk about all that stuff, and we talk about 12 as a slave in that situation as well. But of course, that's America's. You could talk all kinds of stuff. Shame. You could again, sex addiction. We could talk about that, and trauma, and privilege. There's a lot of complexities to what I do, and I have to go there because, again, not necessarily to understand, because I don't think you actually ever completely grasp it, but at least there's a certain kind of foundation that you can move off from. And that's the complexity. Because, again, lots of people like to do things which are, how can I say, people often don't want to deal with the things which are right in front of them because they're difficult. But I like doing that. That's my bread and butter.
There couldn't be a better conclusion, Steve. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.